Hey everyone, one real story today, and I'm going to read the whole thing through in her own words, exactly how she told it. Minecraft's going, let's get into it. My brother and I have generally gotten along fine our whole lives. Not the kind of siblings who are constantly at each other's throats, but not the kind who talk every single day either, somewhere comfortably in the middle most of the time. We shared a room plenty of times growing up on smaller family trips, back when hotel budgets meant 2 double beds in one room was just how things worked for a family of 4, and it never once came up as an issue back then. Not one single complaint from him about it in all those years. That's part of why his reaction on day one caught me so off guard, because there wasn't really a pattern of him being uncomfortable with this kind of arrangement before. Nothing that would have tipped me off that 25 was somehow going to be the age where it suddenly became a problem worth blowing up an entire trip over. I'm 28, and I planned a week-long vacation for myself, my younger brother, and our parents. It was something we'd all been looking forward to for a while. One of the few trips we'd managed to organize as a full family in recent years. Everyone's schedules finally lining up at the same time for once, after a couple of false starts in previous years where someone's work or someone's move to a new city kept pushing the whole idea back further and further. Before I booked anything, I specifically checked with my brother, who's 25, about the sleeping arrangements, because 3-bed houses in the area we were looking at were genuinely hard to come by, and the ones that did have a third bedroom were either far outside our budget or booked out months in advance by the time we started looking seriously. I asked him directly if he'd be okay sharing a bedroom with me, one that had 2 separate beds, so we'd each have our own space to sleep, even while sharing the room itself, the same way we'd shared rooms on family trips plenty of times growing up without it ever being an issue. He said it was fine, that we'd each have our own bed anyway, so it wasn't really a big deal, and he actually asked me to go ahead and book it, no hesitation in his voice that I could pick up on at the time. Once our parents signed off on the trip overall, I booked the house, paid the deposit, and started the group chat rolling with packing lists and arrival times like everyone else. We arrived on the first day, everyone excited, bags getting hauled in, that particular energy a trip has before anything's gone wrong yet. Kids on the street outside kicking a ball around, the smell of someone's neighbor grilling something a few houses down. And almost immediately, before we'd even finished unpacking the car, my brother said he thought the 2 of us should take turns sleeping on the pull-out couch in the living room instead of sharing the bedroom the way we'd already agreed on weeks earlier. For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking, that this was some kind of odd icebreaker to start the trip, and I actually laughed before I realized from his expression that he meant it completely seriously. I told him I wasn't going to do that. If he didn't want to sleep in the room that was designated for the 2 of us, that was his choice, but I wasn't sleeping on a pull-out during vacation when there were clearly 2 actual beds available to us, sitting right there in the room we'd both already agreed to share. I asked him why he'd agreed to the original arrangement in the first place if sharing a room bothered him this much. He told me we were adults now, and that he felt we were too old to be sharing a bedroom like that, as though that particular realization had struck him only once we'd physically arrived at the house, rather than at any point during the weeks of planning that came before it. I asked why this hadn't come up sooner, why he waited until we'd actually arrived to bring any of it up, instead of saying something back when we were still choosing between properties. He admitted, more or less, that he'd only gone along with the original plan, assuming I would end up agreeing to alternate nights on the pullout once we were actually there. Like the whole thing would just sort itself out in his favor, without him ever having to say anything directly, or risk an actual disagreement over text. I told him he shouldn't have assumed that, and that at the very least, he could have had an actual conversation with me about it before we ever left, back when there was still time to plan around it properly. Maybe even find a different property entirely if a third bed genuinely mattered that much to him. He kept pushing, bringing up the adults comment again in slightly different phrasing each time, and I kept saying no. If he wanted to sleep out there for the entire vacation, that was completely fine by me. But I wasn't giving up a bed I'd already agreed to and already paid my share toward just because he'd changed his mind on day one, standing in a driveway with suitcases still in the trunk. So that's what happened. He slept on that pull-out couch every single night of the trip, a full week of it, even though the option to just take the second bed in our room was sitting right there the entire time, unused, made up with clean sheets every single morning by whoever got up first. Here's where it stopped being just about the beds and started actually affecting everyone else too. Because he was out in the living room, which was the main common space in the house, the only place with a television and comfortable seating, and enough room for all four of us to actually sit together in the evenings, he started getting upset anytime people wanted to hang out there while he was trying to sleep. We're talking as early as 8 in the evening, on vacation, with the whole family gathered in one place for the first time in ages, and he'd start pushing everyone to clear out and go to their rooms so he could go to bed, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed until people actually got up and left. My parents pushed back on this more than once, since nobody had signed up to tiptoe around the living room the entire week just because he'd chosen, on his own, to sleep there instead of in the room he'd originally agreed to. I offered, repeatedly, probably 4 or 5 separate times over the course of the week, to let him take the extra bed in our room instead. No hard feelings, no conditions attached from my side, genuinely just wanting the whole thing to stop being a source of tension for everyone else too. But every single time I offered, he'd only agree if I promised, in return, that I would take a turn sleeping on the pullout myself at some point during the trip. I never agreed to that particular deal, since it was the exact same arrangement I'd already turned down on day one, just repackaged as a favor he was asking for instead of something he was simply telling me was happening without my input. By the end of the trip, 7 days and 6 nights total, he was irritated with pretty much everyone, our parents included, over an arrangement that, as far as any of the rest of us could tell, he'd created entirely on his own, complaining on the drive home about how exhausting the whole week had been for him specifically, as though the rest of us hadn't spent that same week walking on eggshells around his schedule. I posted about this online afterward, mostly just venting, honestly, typing it out late one night after we'd all gotten back and I was still turning the whole week over in my head, trying to figure out if I'd handled it right. It ended up getting a lot more attention than I expected, thousands of people weighing in within the first day or two, and the response was about as one-sided as these things ever get online. A lot of people pointed out that he'd essentially set the whole situation up himself by not being upfront from the start, that agreeing to something specific and then unilaterally changing the terms the moment we arrived, without any warning and without any real opportunity for the rest of us to plan around it, wasn't really a reasonable way to handle a disagreement about sleeping arrangements between two adults. One comment that stuck with me said he was old enough to have booked flights and made real commitments to a group trip, but somehow still young enough to act like sharing a bedroom with his own sister for a single week was some kind of personal insult directed specifically at him. Someone else pointed out that if he genuinely felt some kind of shift happening in how he wanted to be seen within the family, wanting more independence, wanting to be treated less like the baby of the group, ambushing everyone with a last-minute demand about sleeping arrangements on the very first morning of a paid, already booked trip, was probably one of the least effective ways available to actually communicate that shift to the people who loved him. A few people said almost the exact same thing in slightly different words, that he'd basically engineered a situation where he got to appear put upon and inconvenienced the entire week, while conveniently never having to be the one who said, out loud and in advance, what he actually wanted from the trip. Reddit users were far less inclined to give my brother any sympathy than the professional experts had been, and the comments only got more pointed the longer the post stayed up. One person wrote that he'd essentially own-goaled himself all the way through the entire trip, creating his own worst outcome and then acting surprised when nobody rushed to comfort him about it. Another suggested that, in his own head, he probably never actually agreed to anything real at all, that the original yes had just been a way of buying time until he could come up with some workable version of getting me onto that couch instead, without ever having to be the one who said no outright to the plan I'd already put together. Someone else wrote, and this one got repeated a lot in different forms throughout the comments, that if he was upset with anyone about how the week went, it should really be with himself, for his own communication and planning failures, rather than with the rest of us, for simply holding him to something he'd already agreed to weeks in advance. And one comment in particular ended up getting quoted back to me by more than one friend afterward, since apparently it had made the rounds well beyond just that original post. It basically said that my brother wasn't too old to share a hotel room with his own sister for one single week of vacation, but he was absolutely, definitely too old to be acting the way he acted about it once he didn't get exactly what he wanted on day one. Someone in the comments also brought up a study on sibling relationships that apparently found the dynamics between brothers and sisters play a genuinely significant role in how people develop and adjust over the course of their lives, and that being on the receiving end of sibling conflict growing up gets linked to real issues with self-worth and mood later on. I don't know that our situation rises to the level of anything that serious, honestly. We're not exactly a case study in dysfunction. But it did make me think a little differently about the whole week. less as a one-off disagreement about furniture, and more as a small data point in a much longer pattern of how the two of us negotiate, or fail to negotiate, space with each other as adults, now that we're not living under the same roof anymore. There were individual moments from that week that stick out to me more than others when I think back on it now. Small snapshots that somehow capture the whole tone of the trip better than any single argument did on its own. One morning, day 4 or 5, our mom got up early to make coffee and ended up sitting quietly in the kitchen rather than the living room, specifically so she wouldn't wake him. And I remember feeling a small flash of anger watching her tiptoe around her own vacation rental because of an arrangement he'd created entirely by himself, on his own terms, without asking anyone. Another night, we were all watching a movie together. The first time all week it actually felt like the trip we'd originally planned. Everyone actually relaxed for once. And he came out around 9, visibly annoyed, and just stood there in the doorway with his blanket already in hand, until the mood shifted enough that people started quietly drifting off to their rooms early instead of finishing the film. A couple of people who work professionally in family communication and conflict resolution ended up weighing in publicly on the whole thing too, once it started circulating more widely. Their take was a little more balanced than most of the comments, honestly, willing to extend a bit more sympathy to both sides than the average commenter seemed interested in doing. One of them said both of us technically had valid points buried somewhere in the situation, that if he was genuinely uncomfortable sharing a room at 25, that discomfort deserved a real, calm conversation, rather than getting sprung on everyone else on the first day of a trip nobody could easily undo or rebook at that point. But even she landed, in the end, on the idea that the actual responsibility sat mostly on him, since he was the one who'd agreed to something specific ahead of time, and then quietly assumed everyone else would simply adjust once his true preference became inconvenient for him to say out loud, like an adult. Another person, someone who specifically studies sibling relationships professionally, put it more bluntly than the first expert had, saying the terms of an agreement don't really get to change once everyone's already committed money and time and shown up somewhere expecting things to go the way they'd all planned together. If he'd wanted an alternating arrangement from the start, that was a completely reasonable thing to ask for, back when there was still time to plan the house search around it specifically, book something with an actual third bedroom, or at the very least, have all of us discuss it together as a group before any money changed hands, and we were all standing in a driveway somewhere with our suitcases already out of the trunk. Looking back on the whole week now, what actually bothers me most isn't even the couch itself, or the 8 o'clock bedtime standoffs in the living room, or any of the individual arguments we had along the way about who owed who what kind of compromise. It's that he had every opportunity, weeks in advance, over text, over a phone call, at literally any point before we got in the car and started driving, to just say what he actually wanted, clearly and directly. Instead, he said yes to something specific, let me build an entire trip and an entire budget around that yes, and then acted like the rest of us were the unreasonable ones for expecting him to actually stick to it once it stopped being convenient for him personally. A couple of my closest friends had already heard the short version of this story before I even posted anything online, since I'd been texting one of them updates in real time throughout the actual week, mostly out of sheer disbelief at how the whole thing kept escalating day after day. She's told me since that reading the actual online reaction afterward, with thousands of strangers weighing in one after another, felt almost validating in a strange way, since it matched almost exactly what she'd been telling me in real time, while it was still happening day by day. That he was clearly the one who'd created the problem in the first place, and then acted like the injured party once everyone else simply refused to rearrange their whole week around one person's last-minute change of heart. A coworker of mine, when I mentioned it briefly at the office afterward during a slow afternoon, told me a nearly identical story about her own brother from a trip several years earlier, right down to the sudden day-one reversal and the surprise demand that everyone else accommodate a change nobody had actually agreed to in advance, complete with her own version of the pull-out couch and her own version of an 8 o'clock bedtime standoff in a rental living room somewhere else entirely. It made me wonder, honestly, whether this is just a more common pattern than I'd realized, something that plays out in slightly different forms across a lot of families once siblings hit their mid-20s and start renegotiating, consciously or not, what closeness and independence are supposed to look like around people they've known their entire lives. I've thought a lot since we got back about why he might have done it this way, instead of just being honest from the start. And I keep landing on a few different theories that all feel partially true, without any single one of them feeling like the complete explanation. Part of me thinks he genuinely didn't think it through in advance, that the discomfort only became real to him once he was standing in the actual bedroom, looking at the actual two beds, rather than existing as some abstract concept back when we were just discussing logistics over text weeks earlier. Another part of me thinks he assumed, probably correctly in his own head, that if he brought it up early, I would have just found a way to accommodate him, maybe by pricing out a third bedroom option, even if it cost more, and that ambushing everyone on day one somehow felt easier to him than having that slightly awkward conversation up front, where he'd have to actually articulate what he wanted and why. My parents have said since we got back that they don't think this is really about beds at all. Not fundamentally, not underneath everything else that happened that week. They think it's more about him wanting to feel like an independent adult around people who still, in some ways, see him as the youngest one in the family, the baby of the group, even now at 25, and not quite knowing how to ask for that shift directly and constructively, so it came out sideways instead, as a fight about furniture and sleeping arrangements, rather than a fight about what he actually wanted the whole trip, and maybe the broader family dynamic in general, to look like going forward as we all get older. I don't know if that's exactly right, but it's the most generous explanation any of us have been able to come up with so far. And even generous explanations don't really undo a week of him sulking on a pull-out couch and picking fights with our parents over what time everyone needed to go quiet for the night. Understanding a possible reason behind someone's behavior isn't quite the same thing as excusing how that behavior actually played out for everyone else stuck living through it in real time. My parents, for their part, mostly stayed out of the direct back and forth between me and my brother. But they weren't exactly neutral bystanders either, especially once his complaints about the living room started interrupting their own evenings too. My dad in particular got visibly frustrated by day 3, pulling my brother aside after breakfast and telling him directly that he was welcome to sleep wherever he wanted for the rest of the trip. But that didn't mean the rest of the house had to reorganize its entire schedule and its entire evening routine around one person's choice that nobody else had agreed to. My mom mostly just tried to keep the peace in the moment, redirecting conversations away from the topic whenever it started heating up at dinner, changing the subject to something lighter, almost on instinct, the second she felt tension building around the table. Though she's admitted since getting home that she found the whole week more draining, emotionally, than she expected a supposedly relaxing family vacation to ever be. There's also a version of this where I wonder if I could have handled it slightly differently myself, even though I still think I was right to hold the line on the actual sleeping arrangement. Maybe I could have pulled him aside privately on day 1 instead of having that first conversation partly in front of our parents, given him a little more room to save face while still not budging on the actual outcome. I don't know if that would have changed anything about how the rest of the week went, since the core disagreement would have stayed exactly the same either way. But it's one of those small what-ifs that stuck with me a little longer than I expected it to. We haven't really talked about it directly since we got home, not in any deep way that actually resolves anything. It's been mentioned once or twice, briefly, in the kind of tone families use when they've silently agreed not to relitigate something out loud. A joke here, a pointed comment there. But it clearly hasn't fully resolved itself underneath the surface either. I don't know if the next family trip happens the same way, with the same sleeping arrangements simply assumed and unquestioned by everyone involved, or if this particular trip ends up being the thing that finally makes all of us sit down and actually talk logistics out loud, clearly and specifically, before anyone books anything again going forward. I've also started wondering whether this is going to change how future trips get planned in a broader sense, not just the sleeping arrangements specifically. Up until now, I've generally been the one who ends up organizing these things, since I'm the one who enjoys the logistics side of it, comparing listings and reading reviews and figuring out what actually fits everyone's budget. Part of me wonders if I should start building in some kind of formal check-in before booking anything in the future, an actual conversation where everyone has to say their preferences out loud in front of the whole group, rather than just replying yes to a message from their phone. So nobody gets to quietly change their mind later once we're all already standing somewhere with our bags, and there's no realistic way to undo the plans. My brother did apologize, eventually, in a fairly brief way, a few weeks after we got back, over text rather than in person. More of a general, sorry things got weird, than any kind of detailed accounting of what specifically he thought he'd done wrong, or how he might do things differently the next time we all travel together. I accepted it, mostly because I don't think dragging the whole thing out further was going to accomplish anything at this point. But I also noticed he didn't really offer anything concrete about how he'd handle it differently next time, which left me a little unconvinced that we've actually resolved the underlying issue, so much as just agreed to stop talking about this specific instance of it. Either way, I know one thing for certain. Next time, everyone states their actual preferences before any money gets spent, not after we've already arrived and unpacked. That's the story for today. A sister who booked a trip everyone agreed to in advance. A brother who changed the terms the moment it was too late for anyone to undo them. Thousands of strangers online who landed almost entirely on one side of it. And a family still quietly working out whether that week was really about a couch at all, or about something neither sibling had quite figured out how to say out loud yet. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want more of these, and I will see you next time.